The air conditioning in Margaret Keller's office hummed with a wheeze that reminded me of an old refrigerator giving up. I sat in one of the two chairs across from her desk, my hands folded in my lap, and waited. The other chair was empty. Richard was latent by much, maybe 4 minutes, but enough that Margaret had glanced at her watch twice, and I'd counted the water stains on the ceiling tiles, 3 of them, arranged like a constellation, I didn't recognize. The office smelled like old coffee and paper, that particular scent that law offices seem to cultivate whether they mean to or not. Through the window behind Margaret's desk, I could see a slice of parking lot, and beyond that, if I tilted my head just right, a sliver of ocean, 2 blocks away, close enough that when the wind blew from the east, you could taste salt in the air. I'd worn a navy cardigan over a white shirt, clothes that felt serious without trying too hard. My wedding ring was long gone, but I still had the habit of twisting the bare finger when I was nervous. I caught myself doing it now and stopped, pressing my palms flat against my thighs instead. When the door finally opened, Richard came in with his lawyer, a younger man in a suit that looked expensive but didn't fit quite right across the shoulders. The fabric pulled when he moved, and there was a slight sheen to it that caught the fluorescent light. Richard didn't look at me. He nodded to Margaret, took his seat, and set his phone face down on the table between us. The phone had a case with a photo on it, a beach somewhere, but not our beach. Somewhere tropical, with palm trees. "Thank you both for coming," Margaret said. She was 60-something, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She'd handled my divorce 11 years ago, and I'd sent her a Christmas card every year since, though I didn't know if she remembered. "We're here to discuss the property at 47 Dune Road and come to an arrangement that works for both parties." Richard's lawyer, his name was Brandon, I'd learned from the email that had requested this meeting, opened a folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward me. His hands were pale and scrubbed looking, nails trimmed so short you could barely see them. "My client is prepared to offer a buyout," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that probably worked well in front of juries. "Mrs. Carson can review the terms, but in short, we're proposing a transfer of the property to Mr. Carson in exchange for fair market compensation." I didn't pick up the paper. I looked at Richard instead. He was 52 now, same as me, but he'd started dyeing his hair, and the color was a shade too uniform, like wood stain. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we'd signed the divorce papers. Deeper grooves that spoke of squinting and stress. We'd been divorced for 11 years. We'd built that house together 26 years ago. "You didn't earn it," Richard said, and his voice was flat, like he'd practiced the line in front of a mirror. Maybe he had. "I paid for the land. I handled the permits. You were there, sure, but I did the work that mattered." Margaret's pen paused mid-note. The scratching sound it had been making against her legal pad stopped so abruptly that the silence felt heavy. I felt the air go still in a way that had nothing to do with the wheezing AC. I took a breath, let it out slow, and kept my hands where they were. "That's not true," I said. "Prove it," Richard said. Brandon shifted in his seat, crossing one leg over the other. He had the look of someone who thought this was going to be quick, that I'd look at the number on that piece of paper and decide it was worth the fight. I wondered what Richard had told him. I wondered if he knew about the summers, the weekends, the years of work. Margaret set her pen down and folded her hands on the desk, her reading glasses glinting. "Richard," she said, and her voice had a warning in it, the kind of tone that made you sit up straighter without meaning to. "I think we should take a step back and review the facts before we make any claims about who earned what." "The facts are simple," Richard said. He still wasn't looking at me. He was looking at a point somewhere past Margaret's left shoulder, at the diplomas on the wall, or maybe at nothing. "I bought the land, my money, my name on the check, both names on the deed," I said quietly. "Because we were married," Richard said. "That's just paperwork." "Paperwork matters," Margaret said. "The first weekend we worked on the house, it was just the two of us, and Richard's cousin Danny, who'd driven down from Providence with a truckload of tools he'd borrowed from his contractor brother-in-law. It was late June, 1999, and the lot we'd bought was nothing but sand and scrubgrass, and a few wooden stakes with orange tape tied to them, marking the corners. We'd closed on the land in April, saved for 3 years to do it, and the plan was to build slowly, weekends and vacations, cash as we had it, no mortgage if we could help it. The savings had come from everywhere. Richard worked construction during the week. framing houses for a developer who paid in cash when he could, and checks when he couldn't. I worked at Dr. Fielding's office, doing medical billing, 40 hours a week at $11 an hour, which felt like good money back then. We ate spaghetti 3 nights a week. We didn't go to movies. We drove a truck that was 8 years old and made a clicking sound when you turned left. Every month, whatever was left after bills went into the coffee can on top of the refrigerator, and when the can got full, we took it to the bank. It took 3 years to save $18,000. Danny backed the truck up as close as he could get to our lot, the tires sinking slightly in the soft sand near the road. We unloaded 2x4s, a circular saw, a level that was older than I was, and a blue cooler packed with sandwiches. I'd made that morning turkey in Swiss, because that's what we could afford, and a case of beer that Danny had brought. The sun was high and mean, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer, and I'd forgotten to bring a hat. Richard tied a bandana around his forehead and looked like a guy in a music video, which made Danny laugh so hard he nearly dropped a box of nails. "First thing," Richard said, spreading the graph paper plans across the hood of the truck and weighing down the corners with rocks, "is we get the foundation stakes square. Then we can start framing." The plans were in his handwriting. Careful and precise, each room labeled, each measurement marked. He'd drawn them over the course of 6 months, erasing and redrawing, measuring twice and then measuring again. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that opened into the living area, windows facing the water, 1,600 square feet, small enough to build ourselves, big enough to live in. I had the tape measure, a yellow Stanley that Richard had owned since before we met. Richard had the level, checking and rechecking every measurement. Danny had the stakes and a sledgehammer, driving them into the sand while we called out numbers. The work was slow and tedious, and my shoulders started to ache after the first hour, but there was something satisfying about it, the way the shape of the house started to appear in the stakes and string a ghost of what it would become. We worked through the afternoon, pausing only to eat sandwiches that had gotten warm in the cooler and drink beer that had gotten warmer. By the time the sun started to drop, we had the outline marked and the first few posts sunk into the sand, braced with scrap wood. My hands had blisters forming on the palms, and my shoulders were burning from the sun. Mrs. Landry from the house next door came over with lemonade in a plastic pitcher and 3 mismatched cups. She was 70-something even then, with a sun hat the size of a wagon wheel and a face that had seen decades of beach weather. Her house was a weathered gray cottage with blue shutters, set back from the road with a garden full of Rosa rugosa and beach grass. "You two are brave," she said, looking at our stakes and string. "Or crazy. I haven't decided which." "Both," I said, and she laughed, a sound like wind chimes. Richard took a picture with a disposable camera, one of those Kodak ones you bought at the drugstore. 27 exposures, with a little cardboard wheel you turned to advance the film. He got me holding a post, squinting into the light, my hands dusty, and my shirt stuck to my back with sweat. Danny made a joke about us being on HGTV someday, one of those home renovation shows that were just starting to get popular. Richard said we'd be lucky if the thing didn't blow over in the first storm. We didn't know, that day, how long it would take, how many weekends, how many arguments over whether to use pine or cedar, how many trips to the hardware store because we'd miscalculated and needed 1 more box of screws. We didn't know we'd be married for another 14 years, and then we wouldn't be. We just knew we were building something, putting down roots in the sand, making something permanent out of wood and nails and stubbornness. That night, we drove home exhausted and sun-drunk, and I fell asleep in the truck before we even got to the highway. Richard woke me up in the driveway of our apartment, his hand gentle on my shoulder. We were still good then. We were still happy. By the end of that summer, we had the frame up and the roof sheathed, though not shingled yet. The skeleton of the house stood against the sky, raw, wood-pale, and new. And you could walk through the rooms, even though there were no walls yet, just studs marking where walls would be. I took time off, work-eyed, accrued vacation days, and used them all. Plus, a couple of unpaid days that Dr. Fielding allowed, because he was a kind man who liked to hear about the house at Monday. Morning staff meetings. Richard worked construction during the week, so weekends were his time to be the architect, the foreman, the guy who made decisions. I learned how to use a nail gun that summer. Richard showed me once, demonstrating the angle and the pressure, the way you had to hold it firm and squeeze the trigger in one smooth motion. Then he handed it to me and said, "Your turn." The first time I pulled the trigger, the recoil surprised me, and I put a nail through the sheathing at an angle that would VE made a carpenter cry. Richard didn't say anything, just nodded at the next spot. By the end of the day, my nails were straight, and my arms ached in a way that felt like accomplishment. We bought materials as we went, never more than we could afford in a given month. I kept a spiral notebook in the glove box of our truck, the kind with a red cover and a wire binding that always managed to catch your finger when you turned the pages. Every time we stopped at Miller's Hardware or the lumber yard out on Route 9, I wrote down what we bought and how much it cost. Richard said it was for taxes, maybe, or just to keep track, but really, I think I liked having a record, proof that we were doing this, one board at a time, one receipt at a time. Miller's Hardware was a place that smelled like sawdust and motor oil, with narrow aisles and bins full of screws and nails sold by the pound. The owner was a man named Carl who knew Richard from job sites and always gave us a contractor's discount, 10% off, which added up. I still remember the way the receipts looked, printed on thin paper that faded if you left it in the sun, the logo at the top a hammer and saw crossed like swords. On the first Saturday in August, we had 6 people out there: Danny and his wife Michelle, Richard's brother Tom, Mrs. Landry's son Kevin, who was home from college for the summer, and a guy named Paul who worked with Richard and owed him a favor for helping move a couch. We put up the interior walls that day, framing out the bedrooms and the bathroom. I remember the sound of hammers going all at once, like a drum line, syncopated and chaotic, but somehow working together. The smell was fresh cut wood and sunscreen, the coconut kind that everyone used back then, and somebody's cigarette, smoke drifting over from the road where Kevin had gone to take a break. Michelle brought sandwiches, better ones than I'd been making, with fancy mustard and lettuce that was still crisp. Mrs. Landry brought cookies, oatmeal raisin, in a tin with a picture of a lighthouse on the lid. We ate sitting on the subfloor with our legs dangling over the edge, feet swinging above the sand, and talked about nothing important: the Red Sox, the weather, whether the roof pitch was steep enough for snow, even though it barely snowed at the beach. Richard's brother brought his camcorder, one of those big VHS ones with the flip-out screen and a battery pack that weighed as much as a small child. He filmed everything, me measuring studs, Richard and Paul lifting a header into place, Mrs. Landry's son handing up nails from the ground, Danny making faces at the camera. The camera caught things we did unthink to pay attention to at the time: the way the light slanted through the unfinished walls, the sound of the ocean in the background, the easy rhythm of people working together toward something. At one point, Richard held up a receipt from Miller's and grinned at the camera. "Playing up for Tom, $248 for shingles," he said into the lens, waving the paper. "And Lisa's gonna make me return the extras if we don't use 'em all." "Damn right I am," I called from somewhere off camera, and everyone laughed. I didn't know, that day, that the tape would matter, that someone would dig it out of a box in Tom's garage 26 years later and have it digitized at a place in the strip mall that also did passport photos and bulk photo printing. I just knew we were tired and sunburned, and the house was starting to look like a house, like something you could imagine living in. By the time the sun set that day, we had walls. Bare studs, no drywall yet, but walls that divided space, that made the house feel real. We stood back and looked at it, all 6 of us in a line, and nobody said anything for a minute. We were too tired to talk, but also too satisfied. We'd done that, we'd made that happen. After we split, I kept the beach house. It was in the separation agreement, negotiated over 3 months in the fall of 2013, and signed in March of 2014. Richard got the condo we'd bought in the city 5 years earlier, a 2-bedroom in a building with an elevator that worked most of the time, and a parking space in the basement garage. The condo was worth more on paper, but the beach house was worth more to me. We'd paid off the land years before, the final payment made in 2004. The year Richard got promoted to site supervisor and started making real money. The house itself had no mortgage because we'd built it the way we'd planned: cash and sweat and borrowed tools. The property had appreciated, of course. By 2014, when we signed the papers, the land alone was worth $180,000, 10 times what we'd paid for it. The house on top of that, well, Richard's lawyer had tried to argue for a sale and a split, claiming the asset was too valuable to award to one party. My lawyer, Margaret, had pointed out that I'd kept the house maintained, paid the taxes every year, handled the insurance, and lived there more months out of the year than Richard ever had. Richard had been spending most of his time at the condo by then, closer to work, closer to the life he was building that didn't include me. The judge had agreed. I got the house, Richard got the condo, and we both walked away. For 11 years, that was fine. I painted the shutters first, a pale blue, then a darker navy when the pale blue started to look washed out. I replaced the deck boards after a nor'easter in 2017 took out half of them, the wind lifting them like playing cards and hurling them into the dunes. I paid someone named Rick, who ran a handyman business out of his garage, to reseal the windows when the salt air started getting in, leaving white crusty deposits on the sills. I lived there. It was mine in a way that felt deeper than paperwork. Mine in the way of things you've fought for and maintained and refused to give up on. Then, 2 months ago, Richard called. I hadn't heard from him in 3 years, not since his mother's funeral. And even then we'd only nodded at each other across the church hall, while other people offered condolences and ate cast. The phone rang on a Tuesday evening in August, and when I saw his name on the screen, my first thought was that someone had died. My second thought was that I should let it go to voicemail. I answered. "Lisa," he said, and his voice sounded strange, tight in a way I remembered from the worst fights we'd had. "I need to talk to you about the house." "What about it?" "I want to talk about the arrangement." "There is no arrangement," I said. "The divorce was final. The house is mine. I paid for the land," he said. I stood in my kitchen, looking out the window at the ocean, at the evening light turning the water silver and gold. "We both paid for the land." "I paid more," he said. "I was making more." "You were working part-time." "I was working 40 hours a week," I said. My voice came out sharper than I'd intended, and I took a breath, tried to pull it back to calm. "I paid half the bills. We saved together." "I think we should revisit the terms," Richard said. "My financial situation has changed. I think we should talk about what's fair." "The court already decided what's fair." "The court didn't know everything," he said, and I could hear something desperate creeping into his voice, something that made me think of a man backed into a corner. "I'm just asking you to talk to me. Just a conversation." "I don't think that's a good idea." "Lisa," I hung up. My hands were shaking, and I set the phone down on the counter and pressed my palms flat against the cool tile. Through the window, the ocean kept moving, indifferent to everything. I stood there until my heartbeat slowed, and then I poured a glass of wine and sat on the deck and tried not to think about what Richard might do next. A week later, I got a letter from Brandon, the lawyer with the too-tight suit, though I didn't know about the suit yet. The letter was printed on heavy cream-colored paper with a letterhead that said Walsh and Associates in a serif font that was trying very hard to look trustworthy. It said Richard was prepared to pursue legal remedies to assert his interest in the property at 47 Dune Road, and would I please contact his office to discuss an equitable resolution. I read it 3 times, standing at my mailbox at the end of the driveway. And then I walked back to the house and called Margaret Keller. Margaret read the letter over the phone while I waited, listening to the sound of pages rustling. "He doesn't have a claim," she said finally. "The divorce decree is clear. The property was awarded to you, but he can make noise, and noise costs money to deal with. Let's meet with him and shut this down before it becomes expensive." "What do I need to bring?" I asked. "Everything," Margaret said. "Every receipt, every photo, every piece of paper that shows your involvement with that house. Bank statements, tax returns, maintenance records. If you've got it, bring it." I spent the next 2 weeks going through boxes in the garage, pulling out old files and receipts and the spiral notebook I'd kept in the truck. I found the checkbook from our joint account, the one we'd closed after the divorce, with stubs showing payments to Miller's Hardware and the lumber yard and the county clerk's office. I found photos, not many, because we hadn't taken many back then, but enough. Disposable camera prints with the dates stamped on the back in orange ink, showing the house in various stages of construction. I found a Polaroid of me, standing on a ladder, paintbrush in hand, my hair tied back with a bandana. I found a receipt from a roofing company for the work after the nor'easter, $3,400 paid in full on my credit card. I found the insurance binder from 2015, listing me as the sole policyholder. I found a property tax bill from last year, paid by check, my signature at the bottom. I put everything in a folder, and then I called Margaret and told her I was ready. Back in Margaret's office, I still hadn't picked up the paper with Brandon's buyout offer. Brandon was looking at his client, and Richard was looking at his phone, his thumb scrolling through something I couldn't see. Margaret set her pen down and folded her hands. "Before we discuss any buyout," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made you sit up straighter, "I'd like to establish the facts." "Lisa, "Can you walk us through your involvement in the construction and maintenance of the property?" I nodded. I'd been thinking about this for weeks, going through it in my head at night when I couldn't sleep, making sure I had the timeline right, making sure I could tell it without getting emotional. I didn't need notes now. I knew the story by heart. "We bought the land in April of 1999, I said. "It cost $18,000. We saved for 3 years to buy it. Richard's name and my name were both on the deed from the start. We built the house over the next 2 years, weekends, vacations, anytime we could get people to help. I was there every weekend. I measured, I nailed, I tiled the bathroom floor, I painted every wall. I learned how to use a nail gun. I learned how to read a level. I learned how to cut trim at an angle so the corners matched up." My voice was steady, and I was grateful for that. Richard still wasn't looking at me. After Hurricane Floyd in September of '99, I was the one who went out at 2 in the morning with a tarp because the roof was unfinished and the rain was coming through. I was the one who held that tarp down while Richard nailed it, soaked through and freezing, because we couldn't afford to lose what we'd already built. "You didn't handle the permits," Richard said, finally looking up from his phone. "I picked them up from the county office," I said. "You filled them out, but I drove to the courthouse in the middle of my workday and paid the fee and waited in line for 45 minutes, $160. I have the receipt." Brandon shifted in his chair, uncrossing and recrossing his legs. "Receipts from 25 years ago. I kept a notebook," I said, "and I have the bank statements. Joint account. Every purchase for materials came out of that account. I can show you the checks. I can show you the register entries in my handwriting and Richard's handwriting, because we both made the deposits and wrote the checks." Margaret opened a folder on her desk and slid a stack of papers toward Brandon. Photocopies, neat and labeled with sticky tabs marking specific entries. The first one was a check stub from August 1999, written to Miller's Hardware for $248. The memo line said shingles in Richard's handwriting. "This is circumstantial," Brandon said, but his voice had lost some of its smoothness. "It's documentation," Margaret said. "It's a paper trail showing joint investment in the property. And we have more." She turned to the next page, another check stub, this one for $312, written to the lumber yard on Route 9. The memo line said, "Framing bedroom walls," in my handwriting. Richard leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I don't care about receipts. I paid for that land. I was the one with the job that covered the costs." She was working part-time, billing for a doctor's office, making $11 an hour. "I earned that house." The room went quiet again. Outside, I could hear traffic, the distant sound of a truck shifting gears. Margaret's coffee maker gurgled on the filing cabinet, brewing a fresh pot that nobody would drink. "I worked 40 hours a week," I said, and I was proud that my voice didn't shake. "Sometimes more, when Dr. Fielding needed someone to stay late for month-end billing. I paid half the bills. I bought half the groceries. I was there every weekend, building that house. I mixed concrete. I held boards while you cut them. I carried shingles up a ladder. You don't get to erase that because you made more money than I did." "Prove it," Richard said again, and there was something ugly in his voice now, something mean that hadn't been there before. Margaret reached for another folder, this one thicker than the first. The tape had been in Tom's garage for more than 20 years, in a cardboard box with a dozen other VHS cassettes. Family, birthdays, a cousin's wedding, somebody's high school graduation that nobody had watched since the day it was recorded. The box had been shoved on a shelf behind paint cans and fishing gear, accumulating dust and the smell of motor oil. Tom's wife Sarah had decided to digitize them all last year, part of a project to organize their photos and videos before everything degraded past saving. She'd been reading articles about how VHS tapes had a lifespan, how the magnetic tape broke down over time, how you could lose everything if you waited too long. She'd taken the box to a place called Memory Lane Media out near the mall in a strip between a nail salon and a pizza place, and they'd transferred everything to a thumb drive for $1 per minute of footage. Tom had texted me a month ago casual, just a "Hey, we had some old tapes digitized and there's footage of you guys building the beach house. Want a copy?" I'd said yes, thinking it would be nice to see the old footage, to remember what we'd looked like back then, but I hadn't watched any of it until Margaret mentioned it in a phone call last week. "Do you have any photos or videos from the construction?" she'd asked. "Anything that shows you actively participating?" I'd remembered the text from Tom. I'd called him, and he'd sent me the file that evening to gigabytes. 43 minutes of footage, transferred through a file-sharing site that took 20 minutes to download on my internet connection. I'd watched it alone, sitting on my couch with my laptop, and I'd cried. Not because it was sad, but because it was so vividly alive, the way we'd moved together, the way we'd laughed, the way we'd been so certain we were building something that would last forever. Margaret had watched it too. After I sent her the file, she'd called me back within an hour. "This is good," she'd said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like relief, or maybe vindication. "This is very good. Bring the drive to the meeting. We'll need to show them." Now, in her office, she opened her laptop and turned it so the screen faced the center of the desk, visible to all of us. Brandon and Richard leaned in slightly. I stayed where I was. I'd already seen it. I didn't need to see it again. "This is footage from August 7th, 1999, Margaret said, her fingers moving over the trackpad, pulling up the file. "Filmed by Tom Carson, Richard's brother. It was digitized last year and provided to me by Lisa." She pressed play. The video was grainy, the colors oversaturated in that way old camcorder footage always was, the blues to blue, the greens to green, everything slightly unreal. The first shot was of the house frame, studs and headers rising against a sky so blue it looked fake, the ocean visible in the distance as a band of darker blue. Then, the camera swung around, and there was Danny, waving at the lens with both hands like he was flagging down a plane, and Paul, grinning and holding a nail gun, like a trophy. The audio was muffled, mostly wind and the sound of hammering, a rhythmic banging that sounded distant and close at the same time. You could hear voices, though under the wind someone laughing, someone calling out a measurement. The camera moved again, panning across the site, and there I was, younger, my hair darker and longer, wearing a t-shirt that said Cape May and a pair of denim shorts with paint stains on them. I had a tape measure in one hand and a pencil behind my ear, and I was measuring the gap between two studs, calling out numbers to Richard, who was out of frame. The camera zoomed in, shaky, the way handheld cameras always were, and I looked up and laughed. "Get that thing out of my face, Tom," I said, my voice tinny through the laptop speakers. The tape rolled, and the room remembered who lifted the beams. The camera panned to Richard, who was holding a stud in place while Paul nailed it, his shoulders braced against the weight. Then to Mrs. Landry's son Kevin, handing up a box of nails from the ground, his Red Sox cap backward on his head. Then back to me, this time kneeling on the subfloor, marking a line with a pencil and a carpenter's square, my tongue between my teeth in concentration. The time stamp ticked forward. 10:47 a.m., 10:51 a.m., 10:58 a.m. The camera caught Richard holding up a receipt, grinning at the lens, his face sun-flushed and happy. $248 for shingles, he said, waving the paper. "And Lisa's gonna make me return the extras if we don't use them all." Off camera, my voice, "Damn right I am." Laughter, and the camera swung away, catching Danny climbing a ladder with a drill, Michelle handing up sandwiches, the house taking shape in fragments, in moments strung together. Margaret paused the video. The image froze on me, younger, laughing, a hammer in my hand. "There's more," she said. "About 40 minutes total. But I think this makes the point." Brandon was quiet, his jaw working like he was chewing something tough. Richard was staring at the screen, his face unreadable, his hands flat on the table. "This doesn't change anything," Richard said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "I still paid for the land." "You both paid for the land," Margaret said. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her voice calm and steady. "Joint account, joint deed, and you both built the house." This video shows Lisa actively participating in the construction. Not just being there, as you put it, working, contributing, building. "That was 26 years ago," Richard said. "And the house is still standing," I said. Because I'd been taking care of it, I pulled out the next receipt from the folder Margaret had prepared. This one was from 2017, from a roofing company in town called Coastal Repairs. It was an invoice printed on blue paper, the ink faded slightly but still legible, for $3,400 paid in full, for replacing deck boards and resealing the roof after the nor'easter that had torn through in March of that year. The storm had been fierce, wind gusts up to 70 miles an hour, rain coming sideways, the kind of weather that made you wonder if your house would still be there when you woke up. My name was on the invoice as the customer. My credit card had paid it, the charge showing up on my statement with the date March 23, 2017. I've replaced the deck twice, I said, sliding the invoice across the table toward Brandon. Once after that storm, and once 2 years ago when the boards started to rot. I've resealed the windows 3 times, 2015, 2018, and last year. I've painted the exterior 4 times. I paid the property taxes every year. Last year it was $4,200. I paid the insurance $1,600 a year. I've had the septic system serviced every 3 years like you're supposed to. I've had the gutters cleaned every fall. The HVAC unit died in 2019, and I replaced it. Cost me $5,000. I can give you receipts for all of it. I pulled out more papers as I spoke, spreading them across the desk like cards in a poker hand. A bill from the septic company, a property tax statement with a canceled check stapled to it, an insurance declaration page with my name at the top, a receipt from the HVAC company, dated June 2019, with my signature at the bottom. Brandon looked at the papers, then at Richard. Richard was still staring at the laptop screen, where the image of me, younger and laughing, was still frozen. This doesn't prove ownership, Brandon said, but his voice had lost all its edge now. He sounded tired, like a man going through motions he no longer believed in. It proves contribution, Margaret said. Which is exactly what you're disputing. Your client claims Lisa didn't earn the property. This video, along with the receipts and bank records, shows that she was an equal partner in its construction. And the maintenance records show that she's been the sole party responsible for its upkeep since the divorce. She's paid tens of thousands of dollars into that property over the last 11 years. She's lived there. She's maintained it. By any reasonable standard, she's earned it. I pulled out one more paper, the last one in the folder. A copy of the deed from 1999, pulled from the county records, with 2 names on it. Richard Matthew Carson and Lisa Marie Carson. Margaret had highlighted both names in yellow marker, bright and impossible to miss. We owned it together, I said. We built it together. And when we divorced, the court gave it to me. You can't undo that because you've decided, 11 years later, that you need the money. Richard's phone buzzed on the table, the vibration loud in the quiet room. He glanced at it, then looked at Brandon. Can we take a break? Margaret nodded. 10 minutes. I stepped outside into air that was cooler than I'd expected. The wind coming off the ocean sharp and clean, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. Margaret's office was on a side street called Harbor Way, with parking in the back and a coffee shop 2 doors down called The Daily Grind. I walked to the corner, where you could see a sliver of beach between the buildings, just a wedge of sand and water and sky, and stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets. A couple walked past with a dog, a golden retriever that pulled at its leash, wanting to investigate every smell. The woman said something I couldn't hear, and the man laughed, and they kept walking. Normal life, continuing around me, while I stood at the corner of a street trying to keep the house I'd built. I thought about that first summer, the way the sun had burned my shoulders red and raw, the way I'd learned what blisters felt like after 8 hours of hammering. I thought about Richard showing me how to hold the nail gun, patient and careful, his hands guiding mine until I got the angle right. I thought about the years after we'd finished the house, when we'd spent weekends there, swimming and grilling fish we'd bought from the market in town, and lying in the hammock Richard had strung between 2 posts on the deck. I thought about the morning he'd told me he wasn't happy anymore. We'd been sitting at the kitchen table in the condo, coffee going cold in our mugs, and he'd said it straight out, no preamble. I'm not happy. I haven't been happy for a long time. I'd known it was true. I'd felt the distance growing between us for months, maybe years. The way you feel winter coming, even when it's still warm outside. We'd tried counseling. We'd tried date nights and weekend trips, and all the things you're supposed to try. Nothing had worked, because the problem wasn't fixable. The problem was that we'd become different people than the ones who'd built a house together in 1999. The divorce had been sad but not bitter. We'd divided things fairly, or what felt fair at the time. He'd wanted the condo because it was closer to his work. I'd wanted the beach house because it felt like mine in a way the condo never had. We'd signed papers and shaken hands with our lawyers and gone our separate ways. I didn't hate him. I didn't even dislike him, most days, but I wasn't going to let him take this. Not because I needed to win, but because the house was mine. I'd earned it, in sweat and money and time, and the law agreed. When I got back to the office, Richard and Brandon were already inside. Margaret was on the phone, her back to the door, speaking in low tones to someone I couldn't hear. She waved me in and wrapped up the call. I sat down. Richard was looking at the table, his phone dark and still in front of him. "We've discussed it," Brandon said, and he sounded like a man delivering news he didn't believe in. "And my client would like to propose a modified arrangement." "I'm listening," Margaret said. "Mr. Carson acknowledges that Mrs. Carson has contributed to the property's maintenance. He's willing to withdraw his claim for a buyout if Mrs. Carson agrees to a formal co-ownership structure, with shared responsibility for taxes and upkeep going forward." "No," I said. Brandon blinked, his perfectly groomed eyebrows rising slightly. "Excuse me, the house is mine," I said. "The divorce decree says so. The deed says so. As of 2014, when we finalized everything. I'm not going back to co-ownership. That's not an arrangement. That's a step backward." "Then, we're at an impasse," Brandon said. "No," Margaret said, her voice carrying a note of finality. "We're not." She opened another folder, this one slim, containing just a few pages. "This is a statement from Eleanor Landry," she said. "Lisa's neighbor at Dune Road. She's 87 now and wasn't able to join us today, but she provided this affidavit last week." Margaret slid the paper across the desk. "I'd read it already. Mrs. Landry's son Kevin had helped her write it, and they'd taken it to a notary at the bank, but it still made my throat tight to see it again." The statement was typed, probably by Kevin, but signed at the bottom in Mrs. Landry's handwriting, shaky and looping but still recognizably hers. "I have lived at 49 Dune Road since 1972. I watched Richard and Lisa Carson build their house in 1999 and 2000. Lisa was there every weekend, working as hard as anyone. She measured, she hammered, she painted. I brought them lemonade and watched that house go up board by board. After the divorce, she's been the only one I've seen at that house. She takes care of it. She fixes things when they break. She's there in the winter when the storms come. It's hers." Brandon read it, his lips moving slightly, then set it down. "This is a character reference," he said, "not evidence." "It's a witness statement," Margaret said, "from someone who was there, someone who watched the construction and has observed the property for 26 years. That carries weight." Richard leaned back in his chair, the movement sharp and frustrated. "This is ridiculous," he said, and his voice had an edge now, something raw, breaking through. "I'm not trying to steal the house. I just think." He stopped. He rubbed his face with both hands, dragging his palms down his cheeks. "I just think it's worth more now than when we split. A lot more. I just think I deserve something." "You got the condo," I said. "That was the agreement. That was what the judge decided was fair." "I sold the condo," Richard said, and there it was, the truth finally spilling out. 2 years ago, I needed the money. There were things happened. Work dried up for a while. I had debts. I had to sell, and there it was. The reason for all of this, the desperation I'd seen in his face when he'd walked in, the tightness in his voice. He'd sold his asset, the thing he'd gotten in the divorce, and now he wanted mine. "That's not my problem," I said, and I meant it without cruelty, just as a statement of fact. "I'm sorry you had financial trouble, but you can't come back years later and undo an agreement because you made choices I did not make." "I built that house too," Richard said. "I know," I said. "And you got your share when we divorced. You chose the condo. I chose the house. That was the deal." Margaret pulled out another document. This one stapled, several pages thick, with a blue backing sheet that marked it as something official. She handed a copy to Brandon and kept one for herself. "This is a title report," she said, "pulled last week from the county records. It shows Lisa Marie Carson as the sole owner of 47 Dune Road, as recorded in the divorce decree filed in March 2014. There are no liens, no encumbrances, no clouds on the title, no claims of any kind. The property is unambiguously hers." Brandon flipped through the pages, his jaw working. Richard was staring at the laptop screen again, where the video was still paused on my younger face. Frozen in a moment of laughter I couldn't remember the context for anymore. "If you'd like to continue this," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm, the tone of someone explaining something to a child who needs to understand, "you're welcome to file a motion with the court. But I'll be honest with you, and I think your attorney will tell you the same thing. You don't have a case. The video, the receipts, the witness statement, the maintenance records, they all support Lisa's claim. And more importantly, the divorce decree is final. It was negotiated, agreed upon by both parties, and approved by a judge. You can't reopen it just because you've changed your mind about the terms or because your financial situation has changed. That's not how it works. She leaned forward, her reading glasses catching the light. And if you do file a motion, Lisa will have to defend it, which means legal fees. And if the court finds that your claim was frivolous or brought in bad faith, you could be ordered to pay her legal fees on top of your own. I don't think that's what you want. Brandon closed the folder slowly. He looked at Richard, and some wordless communication passed between them, the kind of look that happens between lawyers and clients in moments like this. I'll need to speak with my client, he said. Take your time, Margaret said. They stepped into the hallway, and the door closed behind them with a soft click. Through the frosted glass panel in the door, I could see their silhouettes, Brandon's taller and narrower, Richard's broader and hunched slightly. I could hear their voices, low and urgent, but couldn't make out the words. The rhythm was familiar though, the cadence of an argument winding down, of someone being told something they don't want to hear. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the filing cabinet. The coffee smelled burned, like it had been sitting there too long. You want one? She asked. No, thanks. She sat down, sipped, and looked at me over the rim of the cup. You did good, she said, keeping those records. Not many people do. I didn't keep them for this, I said. I don't know. I wanted to remember. I wanted to have proof that we'd done it. Well, Margaret said, you did. And now it matters. I looked at the folders spread across her desk, the receipts and photos and statements, the accumulated evidence of 26 years. It seemed like such a small pile for so much time, so much work. But it was enough. It had to be enough. The door opened. Richard came in first, his shoulders slumped in a way that reminded me of the day we'd signed the divorce papers, that same defeated posture. Brandon followed, and he was carrying his folder like it weighed 1,000 pounds. We're withdrawing the claim, Brandon said. Margaret nodded, her face neutral. I'll draft a confirmation letter for your review. Is there anything else that needs to be addressed today? No, Brandon said. Richard sat down slowly. He looked at me, and for a moment I thought he might apologize. Might say something about the years we'd had, or the house we'd built, or the life we'd shared before it ended. But he didn't. He just said, I hope you're happy there. I am, I said. And it was true. He nodded. He looked at the laptop screen one more time, at the image of us younger, and laughing, and building something together. Then he stood up, gathered his phone, and left. Brandon lingered for a moment, shaking Margaret's hand, offering me a brief nod that might have been respect or might have been nothing. Then he left too, and it was just me and Margaret in the office with the wheezing air conditioner and the burned coffee. I stayed for another 20 minutes, signing papers. Margaret had prepared a formal withdrawal of Richard's claim, a confirmation that the title remained solely in my name, a letter to be filed with the county just to make sure there was no ambiguity going forward. The house was mine. It had always been mine, but now it was official in a new way, stamped and sealed and beyond dispute. You'll get my bill next week, Margaret said, and she smiled when she said it, the kind of smile that said she knew she'd earned her fee. Worth every penny, I said, and I meant it. I gathered my papers, the copies of receipts and statements, and the thumb drive with the video on, put them back in the folder. Margaret walked me to the door, and we shook hands, her grip firm and warm. If he tries anything else, Margaret started. He won't, I said. He knows he can't win. Outside, the afternoon had turned golden, the sun lower in the sky, the shadows long. I got in my car and sat for a minute, my hands on the steering wheel, not quite ready to drive yet. Through the windshield, I could see the coffee shop, a couple, sitting at one of the outdoor tables, a kid on a bike riding past, all the ordinary moments of an ordinary day. I drove home the long way, down the coast road, where the dunes rise on one side, and the ocean spreads out on the other, endless and gray-blue, and capped with white. The sky was that particular October blue, deep and clear, and the light was soft and golden, the kind of light photographers love. I passed the coffee shop where Richard and I used to stop on Sunday mornings, the one with the good scones and the owner who knew our order. I passed the seafood shack where we'd get clams and eat them at the picnic tables while seagulls circled hopefully overhead. I passed the park where we'd walked the dog we'd had for 3 years before she died, a mutt named Sandy who'd loved the beach more than any creature I'd ever known. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt tired and relieved. and a little bit sad for the man who'd sat across from me and tried to take something that had never stopped being mine. Richard had been desperate, and desperation makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. I understood that, but understanding didn't mean I had to give in. When I got to Dune Road, the sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, turning the sky orange and pink. I parked in the gravel driveway, the tires crunching on shells and small stones, and sat for a minute, looking at the house. It needed paint. The shutters were fading from navy to a washed-out blue-gray, and the trim around the windows was starting to peel in places where the salt air got to it. I'd do that in the spring, when the weather warmed up and I could get a few days of dry weather in a row. For now, it was enough to see it standing there, solid and square, the frame Richard and I had built still holding everything up, the roof I'd had replaced after the storm, the windows I'd resealed, the deck I'd rebuilt twice. 26 years of work, 26 years of maintenance and repairs and care. It wasn't just a house, it was proof that I could build something and keep it standing. I got out of the car and walked up the steps. The wood creaked under my feet, the same sound it had made for 26 years, familiar as my own heartbeat. Inside, the air smelled like salt and coffee and the lavender candle I'd burned last night while reading on the couch. I dropped my bag on the kitchen table, kicked off my shoes, and went out onto the deck. The ocean was calm, the waves low and lazy, rolling in with a rhythm I could feel in my chest, in my breath, in the steady thump of my pulse. I leaned against the railing, the wood smooth and sun-warmed under my hands, and looked out at the water. I thought about the video, the way I'd looked younger and happier and so certain that we were building something that would last forever. We'd been wrong about the forever part, at least as far as the marriage went, but the house had lasted. The house was still here, still standing, still mine. I thought about Richard driving away from Margaret's office, probably angry, probably humiliated, probably already regretting that he'd tried. I hoped he'd figure things out. Whatever financial trouble he was in, I hoped he'd find his footing again. But I didn't regret holding firm. Some things you don't give up, not because you're stubborn, but because giving them up would mean erasing part of yourself. The sun dropped lower, painting the water in shades of copper and gold. A fishing boat moved across the horizon, small and dark against the light. Gulls called to each other, their voices harsh and familiar. The wind picked up slightly, cool against my face, carrying the smell of seaweed and brine. I stayed there until the sun touched the water, until the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. Then I went inside, turned on the lights, and made dinner pasta with tomatoes and garlic, simple and quick. I ate at the kitchen table, with a book propped open in front of me, not really reading, just letting my eyes move over the words while my mind wandered. After dinner, I washed the dishes and wiped down the counters and did all the small tasks that make a house feel cared for. I checked the weather forecast on my phone. Rain coming in 2 days, nothing. Sivaran made a mental note to check the gutters this weekend. I watered the plants on the windowsill, herbs I was trying to keep alive through the fall. I folded the blanket on the couch and straightened the pillows. Then I went back out on the deck with a glass of wine and sat in one of the Adirondack chairs Richard and I had bought at a yard sale 15 years ago. Painted white, now weathered to gray. The stars were coming out, scattered across the darkening sky. The ocean was a dark mass now, barely visible except where the white foam of the waves caught what little light remained. I thought about all the receipts I'd kept, all the records and photos and statements. I thought about Mrs. Landry writing her affidavit, her shaky handwriting affirming what she'd seen. I thought about Tom digitizing that video, not knowing it would matter, just thinking his brother and sister-in-law might want to see themselves young again. I thought about how easy it would have been to lose all of that, to throw away the receipts, or delete the photos, or never ask Tom for the video. How easy it would have been to walk into that office with nothing but my word, and how differently things might have gone. But I'd kept the records. I'd held on to proof. And when I needed it, it was there. The house settled around me, the way old houses do, small creaks in size as the wood contracted in the cooling air. Inside, the refrigerator hummed. Outside, the waves kept their rhythm. Above, the stars kept appearing, one by one, until the sky was full of them. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the wine to warm in the glass, long enough for the chill to seep into my jacket. I thought about what I'd say if someone asked me what I'd won today. Not the house, I'd already had the house. What I'd won was the right to keep it, to not have to fight for it again, to know that the work I'd done and the care I'd given mattered in the eyes of the law. That was enough. More than enough. Eventually, I went inside, locked the door, turned off the lights except for the one over the stove that I always left on. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom. The same bedroom Richard and I had framed that August weekend in 1999, and got ready for bed. Before I turned off the lamp, I looked around the room at the walls I'd painted, at the windows I'd chosen, at the floor I'd helped lay. Every piece of it was work, was choice, was mine. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the ocean through the open window. The sound that had been my lullaby for 26 years. Tomorrow I'd check the gutters. I'd call about getting an estimate for painting in the spring. I'd pay the electric bill and buy groceries and do all the ordinary things that keep a life running. But tonight, I just lay there and listened to the waves and felt the house around me, solid and real and earned. The tape had rolled, and the room had remembered who lifted the beams. But more than that, the room had remembered who stayed, who maintained, who kept building, even after the partnership ended. That was the story that mattered. Not just who built it, but who kept it standing. And that was me. The next morning, I woke early, before the sun came up, the way I always did. I made coffee and took it out on the deck, wrapped in a blanket against the October chill. The sky was that deep, blue-black, that comes just before dawn. And the ocean was invisible except for the sound of it. The endless rhythm of waves. I thought about calling Tom to thank him for the video, for keeping those tapes all these years, for taking the time to digitize them. I thought about writing Mrs. Landry a thank you note for her affidavit, for remembering, for caring enough to put it in writing. I'd do both of those things, soon. But not yet. For now, I just wanted to sit with the quiet, and the coffee, and the knowledge that the fight was over. The sky started to lighten, navy to gray to pale blue, and the ocean emerged from the darkness, steel-colored and calm. A few early morning walkers appeared on the beach, small figures moving slowly along the waterline. A dog ran ahead of them, chasing something I couldn't see. I thought about what Richard had said, "I hope you're happy there," and whether he'd meant it. Maybe he had. Maybe beneath the desperation and the attempt to reclaim something he'd given up, there was still some part of him that remembered building this place together. That remembered being happy here before everything fell apart. I was happy here. Not in some grand, triumphant way, but in the quiet, steady way of someone who's exactly where they're supposed to be. The sun broke the horizon, a sliver of orange gold that grew as I watched, spilling light across the water. The house behind me creaked and settled, warming in the new day. Somewhere down the beach, someone laughed. A gull called. I finished my coffee and went inside to start the day the ordinary, precious work of living in a place you've built with your own hands and kept standing through storms and time and the slow erosion of everything. The house was mine. The work was mine. The life I'd built here was mine. And that was enough. That was everything. If you're still here, thanks for listening, and I'll meet you in the comments. Your voice matters.